What would you do if you grew up in a haunted house and couldn't talk about it? You could choose to be scared or you could choose to find answers. When all this research becomes more confusing and also exciting, you have to open up and talk about it. Eventually, everyone starts coming to you with their stories. This is when author John Olsen decided to write a book. Stay tuned. Mystery Media presents Destination Mystery, Case File 21.
You are listening to Mystery Media Group.
Yay! Tonight we are talking with author John Olsen, who wrote Stranger Bridgerland, Beyond Stranger Bridgerland, Stranger West, and Stranger US. John was born and raised in Cache Valley. At the age of 8, he began to realize that the home he lived in was peculiar. His parents still owned the old farmhouse, built in the mid-1880s. Strange experiences such as phantom knocks, loud boots running the stairs, and missing objects became commonplace for him as he grew up. With each run-in with what he called the man in the hat, John's interest in the paranormal grew. He was forbidden by his parents from telling anyone of his experiences for fear of what others in the small community would think. He found solace in learning everything he could about his encounters from library books. As he reached his teen years, his friends would visit his home and have experiences of their own. This opened the door for him to tell others of his experiences. As he shared his extraordinary stories, friends of friends came to him sharing their stories of a brush with the supernatural. Fueled by his own experiences with the unknown, John has spent the last 25 years interviewing and documenting firsthand accounts of those who have witnessed all kinds of strange and unusual phenomenon in the western United States. The Stranger Bridgerland series contains first-hand accounts of everything from ghosts, monsters, and hauntings to glitches in the Matrix, Sasquatch, and UFOs. If you don't know, John drives a really cool truck, and whenever someone in town sees it, they send me a picture and say, "You have to interview this guy." So here he is. Welcome, John. So I first heard about you, John, when I was listening to a podcast and we were driving through Wellsville. And I can't remember if I was listening to Coast or the Paranormal Podcast, but it was one of those two. And you were on the show and I was like, hey, that's where I live. Like, I was like, cool. So I went right home and I ordered the book. At the time, you just had the one.
Oh, right.
And I started reading it. And it's really fun to read the stories from around the places that you live.
Right.
So,
yeah. The first book was all stuff really close by. It was all, I'd been collecting for a long time, but it was all word of mouth at that point. It wasn't until I started doing podcasts that I started getting more stories from all over the place. So,
yeah. And your latest book is Stranger US.
That's the latest one. Yep. Is Stranger US, number 4. And that one's got stories, like it says, from all over the United States. So, and it also has some stories from locally as well, because I've been collecting and interviewing people in the valley since I was about 17. So I still have a ton of stories from the valley that I'd like to put in books as well. So I grew up here locally. I grew up in Hiram. And the home that I grew up in was built in 1883. It's a really old home. And by the time I was 8 years old, I have an older sister and a younger brother. And about that time, we were like, you know what? There's things going on in our house that aren't normal at our friend's house. I grew up in a home that was really paranormally active. Like I said, it was over 100 years old at the time. Now it's quite a bit older than that now. And at first, my parents didn't want us to talk about it at all outside of the home. And so that time, started reading everything I could and just getting into the paranormal and learning about as much as I could about it. And by the time I was a teenager, I would have friends over to the house and they started having experiences and they would ask me, what's going on, with your house? And I had to admit finally, oh yeah, I grew up in a haunted house, and I started telling stories. And I'd go to parties or double dates, and my friends would be like, "Oh, John's house is haunted. Have him tell you some stories." And after that, people started coming to me and saying, "Oh, I heard about your experience." And I guess they felt comfortable sharing their experience with me because of that. And so I just started interviewing people. And if I heard a good story, I would do my best to hunt down the person that it happened to. And from there, it just kind of grew.
Do you find that the more you talk about stuff like this, the more people come to you and are like, hey, I've had this happen to me? And I've noticed, the more open I am, the more people are like, oh, yeah, I've had that happen too.
Yeah, it's amazing. In fact, just the other day, some lady approached me and asked me about it, and it's kind of the same thing. Either they've had an experience or a close relative or something, and they want to tell you this story, and so the more you do it, the more you get people coming to you.
So does this make you cooler, or does this make it so people cross the street so they don't have to pass you?
At first, I think it was more of, people looked at me a little funny. And I was kind of okay with it because I knew I was right in the head. I knew there wasn't anything wrong with me.
More fun and interesting, though.
Right. Definitely. It's fun to tell stories at parties and stuff. But I think, for some reason, for different reasons, it's becoming more acceptable. And, you find more people are having the experiences and you get less of those funny looks.
So what was your first experience?
It's hard to pin down the very first experience that I had in the house. One of the first ones that I remember is from the main level going to the second level up where my bedroom and my brother and sister's bedrooms were, is a really steep stairs, and they actually go up over the bathroom. And at all times of the day and any time at night, you could hear heavy boot steps going up the stairs or a kid running up and down the stairs. And there wouldn't be anybody there. So actually, as little kids talking about it, one of us, I think it was my brother, started calling it the stair monster because, when you're a kid, you think, you kind of want to relate to something. So the boot steps were definitely one of the first things that I remember happening. The first time I remember seeing a full body apparition, I just come home from school. I was in 8th grade at the time. And I came in and I made myself a sandwich and I went into the front room to watch some TV. And I sat down on the couch. And before I could turn on the TV, I saw some motion at the edge of the stairs of the front room. And I looked, and here's a guy standing there, tall, skinny. He had a white shirt on, overalls, and a wide brimmed hat. And I could see through him. I couldn't see his facial features, but I could definitely make out the white shirt and the hat and his overalls. And he walked into the room and sat across from me in the rocking chair and started rocking back and forth. And this is the middle of the day right after school. And I remember closing my eyes and counting to 10. And I opened my eyes and he was gone, but the chair was still rocking back and forth. Wow. And so I jumped up and I ran out of the room and went to find my mom. But it was interesting because I come to find out many years later, when my parents actually started sharing their experiences with me, I come to find out that my mother had seen that same apparition several times. And a lot of us in the family have seen that at times as well.
Did you know who the person was?
So
relative, maybe?
Interestingly enough, the house, I've done research on the house, and it was, like I said, it was built in 1880. And then in the 1920s, teens and 20s, was when a great uncle of mine purchased it and started living in it. And when my grandma passed away, they only lived a block away from where I grew up, my grandma and grandpa. When my grandmother passed away, and we were going through a lot of the old stuff there, I opened up a picture book and was just flipping through. And all of a sudden, there's a picture of my house, a black and white picture, with a guy standing there with a wide brim hat, overalls and a white shirt, skinny guy. And I about fell out of my chair when I saw it.
I'll bet.
And that was actually a great uncle that owned that house. So I was able to pin that down, that's one of the spirits that was in the house when I was growing up.
Did it try to communicate, or is it just there?
There is some residual stuff that goes on. I think footsteps are just residual, but there's definitely interaction. Is a very mischievous ghost, whatever you want to say, and it tends to pick on family members that don't like being picked on the most. For example, so my parents still live in the house, and my kids spent a lot of time at grandma and grandpa's house growing up. My oldest son really doesn't like the ghost. Like it really bothers him when something happens. And my mother had bought a snowman, and it was about 4 foot tall, and it was made out of cloth, and then had a sandbag base on it. And she would bring it up for Christmas and Christmas time in the front room, and it tended to move at night to different places. And my son just really did not like that thing, even from when he was little. One summer, he was 15, and Grandpa paid him to paint the hallway in the basement. And the basement is where it used to be a family room when I was a kid, but now they keep a lot of storage down there. And so my son is in the hallway, and there's only one hallway into the basement. You come down the stairs, and it's just a really small hallway, and then it's a big room. And my son's got his headphones in, listening to music, and he gets this really creepy feeling. And he pokes his head inside and looks, and the snowman's right there staring at him. And so he goes in and he picks up the snowman and he puts it in the corner of the room and then faces it in the corner like it's in timeout. And he goes back to painting in the hallway and puts his headphones back in. About 10, 15 minutes later, he gets this really creepy feeling again, and he turns and looks inside, and not only had it turned around, but it was about halfway across the room towards him, sitting there, and he was done. He went upstairs and told Grandpa he wasn't going to paint one more thing until it was out of the house. So it went out onto the front porch until my mom finally got rid of it.
I don't blame him.
No.
Me either.
Did your parents have some experiences too? Is that why they didn't want to talk about it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing about why they didn't want to talk about it is being from a small community. You guys know how it is, especially back in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
People were really afraid that people were going to talk about, oh no, the Olsens are crazy. They think they have a ghost. So it wasn't until later on that my parents finally admitted that they had their own experiences. My mother would at times be working in the bedroom, making the bed. She said this happened more than once. She would be making the bed, and out of the corner of her eye, she would see my dad walk in, and she'd start a conversation with him. And then when he didn't answer, she would turn, and it was that apparition, and then it would disappear. The bathroom that was in the house, it was the only bathroom at the time, and it had an entrance from the main room and then an entrance into my parents' master bedroom. And I remember coming home one day, and my dad was walling up the side on their bedroom. And I remember asking, why are you closing up that side? And basically my dad was like, it's just the way your mother wants it. And so it was really kind of weird to me because I was young at the time and I didn't understand. But I come to find out later that the reason they did it is because they would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes with the door open and somebody standing in the bathroom watching them. And they figured if they walled that up and closed that, it would stop happening. And it did, but they definitely had their own experiences.
That would be something freaky to wake up to.
Yeah.
Did it bother you living in that house? Was it scare you?
There was only a couple times, like, for example, when I saw that apparition, I was frightened at the time. But oddly enough, growing up in it from when I was, born, it never really frightened me. And, even to today, when I have an experience, whether it's visiting my parents or away from wherever, I'm more fascinated with it than afraid. When I was a kid, there's only that time and maybe one or two other times that I can think of that I was actually frightened by what was going on. So,
where's your favorite place to go ghost hunting?
You would think I do a lot of ghost hunting. Every once in a while I go with a couple groups around. The last time I did was actually really fascinating. I went with a group from here in the Valley, and we went to the Ellen Eccles Theater, and where we were there for about 4 hours, and we had some really fascinating things happen there with lights going off and voices and all kinds of sounds. And I don't know if you guys have ever had a chance to go in there or not, but the Ellen Eccles and then the Eccles house that's on the south side of the building is also very haunted. And that was a really fascinating place to go.
I've been trying to get in there. Nobody will call me back.
Oh no.
But I
It's on our
had
bucket list.
It's on the bucket list. Yeah,
I
definitely.
had an experience there. My kids were in the Les Mis play probably 10 years ago or so. And I volunteered to help with like taking care of them backstage to keep them quiet, make sure they got on stage when it was their cue and stuff. And we were on the very top floor in the back. It was time for them to go on stage. So I'm like, okay, guys, let's go. And they all start heading down the stairs. And I'm in the back making sure everybody got down. And I hear a giggle behind me from the room that we just came from. And I was like, I thought I grabbed everybody. And I went back there to like yell at whoever didn't follow me down. And nobody was there.
Oh,
and
wow.
there's only one entrance. So,
Yeah.
and then later I went on one of the ghost walking tours in Logan. And they talked about the little girl that passed away in that theater. And I was like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I think I might have heard her.
Oh, that's awesome. That's cool. That is cool. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting place for sure.
I want to get in there.
We like paranormal stuff. I'm more into Bigfoot, and you can tell Melissa she likes aliens.
Oh, right.
So I'm going to start with my question about Bigfoot. Have you seen a Bigfoot?
I have not, but that is on my bucket list. I've interviewed a lot of people. I've interviewed a lot of people that have seen Bigfoot, and quite a few here in the Valley. It's interesting. I know you guys talked with John from Cache Valley Bigfoot.
Yep.
And he's one that I've interviewed and talked to, and it's really interesting because you guys know Beaver Mountain, from Beaver Mountain and around up to the top. I've interviewed several people who've had encounters in that area, and they didn't even know that other people have had encounters in that area. So you have Beaver Mountain and around through the Sinks and then up through the top by Bear Lake. And that seems to be a real hot spot, I know, in the valley. So
I think John had his first encounter around the
Beaver Creek
Beaver
Lodge.
Creek. Yeah.
Yep. He let me put one of his stories from there in I think it's my first book.
Yeah,
so.
it's the first one.
And that's one of my favorite stories. I love that one.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a good one.
Never seen one, but both of my sons, we love to go in the mountains all the time. And one time, me and my youngest were up shed hunting, looking for deer sheds. And we came across some tracks. They weren't good enough to make prints because they weren't in soft mud, but you could see where a large creature on 2 feet had come down the hill and gone along along the side of the hill, and way too big for human tracks with the length and the size of the foot. So I would say that's the closest I've ever came so far, at least as far as I know. I've also been in the mountains and known later that I was really close to a mountain lion and never knew it until later. So you never know how close you are, which, is kind of scary, but fun at the same time.
What was your favorite Bigfoot story that you...
So definitely John's, the one at Beaver Creek Lodge, is definitely one of my favorites with the interaction and it banging on the back of the building. Right near
was
that
the
area.
Cabin one?
Yeah, Beaver Creek Lodge.
The cabin?
Yeah, where guests saw it and then decided to leave shortly thereafter. Not too far from that, I interviewed a woman, and her husband at the time, they were just traveling in a Jeep on the back roads, and it was getting closer to dark, and they pulled up and just about 100 yards, maybe a little less from them, there was a man standing there in black. And all of a sudden, I said, was it really big? And she said, no. It was only about 5 foot tall, about the size of a regular man. But when we stopped, it all of a sudden jumped in the tree, the pine tree next to him, and shimmied right to the top, just really fast. And it was at that point they realized that wasn't a man that they saw. They could see it kind of peeking at them from the top of the tree. And as it got darker, they didn't want to be out there any longer, and they ended up leaving. But my belief is that it was a juvenile. She said, I've never seen anything climb that fast. And it went right up to the top of that pine tree where it could hide and keep an eye on them. That's a really good one. I love that one too.
I really wish we could see something like that.
I know. That's me too.
So most of my experiences with ghosts and that kind of thing, but I love UFO stories. They're my favorite. What's your favorite UFO story?
So what I like about this is actually 2 stories, but they corroborate each other. I interviewed a gentleman that came to me, and he worked in Idaho Falls, and he was going to school, and he was a parts deliverer. He would deliver mechanical parts all over for this little company. And one Thursday night, he was just about to get off, and his boss called him in and said, "Hey, they need a part in Jackson Hole, Wyoming tonight." And his boss was like, "If you go deliver it, you can have Friday off. I'll pay you for Friday. I'll even pay for your hotel room in Jackson Hole." And he jumped at the chance. And so he just threw the part and his bedroll in the back of his truck, drove to Jackson Hole, had dinner, and then he's like, I'm going to try and get as close back as I can and just sleep in the back of my truck and save some money and from staying the night. And so he got to Tin Cup, which is a canyon between Jackson Hole and going back towards Idaho, and threw his bedroll and went to sleep. And in the middle of the night, he gets woken up to this hum. His whole cabin the inside of the back of his truck is lit up, and he climbs out the back, and less than 100 yards from him, there is a triangle shaped UFO, not real big. And there's a beam of light coming from the bottom of it into the little stream that goes by, and it's sucking water up through the beam. And he's standing there just looking at it, and he wasn't sure how long he stood there staring at it. And all of a sudden, the beam went off, the hum stopped, but he was close enough that he heard the water fall back into the river. And it sat there for a minute, and then all of a sudden, it started moving, and then boom, it was gone. And he was just dumbfounded by this. And so he just drove. He couldn't go back to sleep. He was freaked out like you would be, and drove home. Got him very interested in UFOs. But what I find really fascinating about that is I interviewed a gentleman, actually before I even interviewed him, that had the exact same thing happen up at the very top of Blacksmith Fork. The only difference was he was in his camper and it happened, and it was a round UFO, a small round UFO, but it was sucking water up exactly the same way. With a beam, it shut off. He heard the water splash, and then it took off. The only difference is 80 miles difference, 15 years different. And these guys didn't know each other and really hadn't shared their story with many other people. But exactly the same thing happened. And it was kind of gave me chills when I got the second story, because, I hadn't written the other story at that point. So, but those are two of my favorites because they tell the same story, but they're separate people.
And that makes you think, okay, these guys are pretty credible because they don't know each other.
Right.
And they're telling the same story.
Telling the exact same story. So, yeah. And it's funny, when I was interviewing the one guy, and the hair is just going on the back of my neck when he's telling me this, because I'm like, I talked to a guy that had the exact same experience. So, and it was really rare. As far as I know, those are the only two I know of where they were taking water out of something. I've heard of them using power sources, but
maybe some of them use water as a power source.
Who knows? Maybe.
That's crazy.
It's possible. Yeah.
I've never heard of that story before, where they're sucking water.
Yeah.
That's new to me.
Yeah. And I hadn't, other than those two people, I had never heard of that before. So
I want to see that too.
Yeah, I do too.
I don't want to be super close, but close enough to see it.
Exactly.
The safety of my vehicle.
Yes. Yep. That is so true.
How did you get interested, or what gave you the idea to put these stories into a book?
So, interestingly enough, I've been collecting them forever. And I got remarried about, I guess, 5.5 years ago. And my wife, I kind of had to explain to her what I was doing with all of these stories. And she looked at me and she said, what are you going to do with all these stories? And I'm like, well, I'm going to make a book someday. And she's like, no, you're going to do it now. She was so supportive. So 5 years ago, I started the first one, and she helped me so much with it. And she's been so supportive through all of it. Something I hadn't experienced. I almost had to hide it before, just because of different things that were going on. But yeah, she was a big influence in helping me get it going. And once the first one came out, I've been able to compile and interview and have one come out every year since. And I'm now working on number 5 right now. So that's a big thing, to have somebody that supports you and loves you, and especially when it's something kind of weird. You know what I mean?
I know that. So Mike and I have been wanting to put together a case files book of our different adventures and investigations and stuff. What would you recommend to us how we get started?
So the biggest thing is just to sit down and start. You'd be amazed at how, when you set time apart to sit down and start writing them up, going through your notes. For me anyway, it's almost like when I get started on the next one, it just takes me a little while, maybe a month to gather everything and get going. But as soon as I start writing, it's just almost like a waterfall gets going. So the best thing to do is just start writing, start getting it going. And when you get going, don't worry too much about your grammar and stuff like that. That'll all get fixed with rewrites and stuff. It's just about getting it out, going through your notes. For me, like when I interview people and I write notes or record the session and just get it down on paper, then it starts cleaning itself up.
What are a few of the most haunted places here in northern Utah and in like southeast Idaho?
I love Logan Canyon has got to be one of the most haunted places. I have a lot of stories up there, and there's a lot of places up there that are just super spooky. There's umpteen different places up Logan Canyon that are haunted as well. Hecate, which I wrote about, somebody who had an experience with them. Obviously, the nunnery, which, you can't go there without permission, but it's also definitely haunted. In my last book during the summer last year, The Comet, and I always forget the name of it, but I interviewed a gentleman who contacted me. Him and his buddy went up Logan Canyon to film The Comet. And while they were doing that, they were basically chased out of the area by a giant orb that came down the hill and freaked them out. So Logan Canyon, the Witch Tree, which you guys know about, it's kind of a fascinating place. Oddly enough, every time I try and find it, I get disoriented up there and can't find it. That's when I got to mark down.
I don't know that I'd be able to find it again.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it, that it disappears like that? It doesn't disappear, but it just is so hard to find. Again, Utah State has a ton of ghosts on there, from the weeping lady at the cemetery. One of the sorority is very haunted up there, the one that's directly across from the...
Yeah, I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Yep, that one's really haunted place. Boy, I could almost go on and on, but... Old Main. One of my books, I was able to interview somebody who had been a janitor at Old Main, and all of the ghosts that are in Old Main. There's a young woman in the basement who's dressed like one of the an old time librarian with black petticoat, and she's always in a hurry but very nice. She was hurrying down the hall and said hi to her, and then passed her, and then was gone. And when she asked her coworkers, they're like, "Oh yeah, that's the librarian. She's always in a hurry wherever she's going." So there's a lot. There's quite a few.
What about Southeast Idaho? Do you know of any cool places up there?
There are a few. I'm trying to remember exactly. I know that there has been Bigfoot sightings down there as well in Southeast Idaho. I did get a chance. This isn't Southeast, but a couple years ago, my wife and I were able to go visit the Idaho State Penitentiary in Boise. That was really fascinating. That's definitely one. I have in one of my books a story about an older home that's been turned into apartments by ISU. Idaho State is very haunted by an old gentleman with heavy boots and knocking on walls. And it's all women that stay in the apartment. And so it's women contracts. They have their own room, but the downstairs is the common area and everything. And she had everything from people knocking and trying to get into her room in the middle of the night. And that was definitely a very scary one as well.
So do you have a story, the craziest, most unbelievable story that nobody would believe? But
yeah, so the one that falls into that category for me, and it's really interesting because, I'll tell you the story and then I'll explain to you what happened recently. In this story, there was a gentleman that I interviewed. He had moved to the valley. He'd come to visit a friend when he was in his 20s, fell in love with the area because he was an outdoorsman and loved to hike and camp and rock climb. He and a buddy were supposed to hike to Mount Naomi. And even though it's a quick hike, they wanted to bring their bedrolls and spend the night up there near Mount Naomi. And at the last moment, his buddy canceled on him. Being in his 20s and being, you're indestructible in your 20s. You don't worry about anything. So he decided he's going to go on his own. It's August and at the time, and there's a burn ban. So he just takes food that he can eat, cold food. So he hikes up there, gets near Mount Naomi and decides he's going to camp, gets off the path, puts out his bedroll, and watches the stars, eats his cold dinner, and he has his headlamp, and he always brings a book with him, an old ratty book, he said, to read. Help him get some sleep. And so he reads his book for a while and goes to bed. He wakes up in the middle of the night, and he's a heavy sleeper. So he wakes up and he's not sure what woke him up. It's dead still up there, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And all of a sudden he catches something whistling at him, and it's really weird. It's not a bird, and it's not a bird he'd ever heard. And all of a sudden he's trying to figure this out, and he's trying to find his headlamp, and he can't find his headlamp. And he's slipping his boots on. And as he's slipping his boots on, he gets hit in the chest with a little rock about the size of a quarter. And not hard, but just tossed at him. And then the whistling starts again. And at this point, he realizes he's still wearing his headlamp. So he flips it on and he turns. And about 15, 20 feet from him, there was a rock pile. If you're aware of the area, nothing but big trees grow up at that range. There's not a lot of bushes because it's so high up. Sitting on this rock pile is a creature. It's grayish green. It's got pointy ears, a pointy nose. He said if it was standing up, it wouldn't even be quite 4 feet tall. Hair didn't have any hair on its body, and it's wearing like an old ratty shirt and some sort of ratty pants, just ragged. And he's just in shock. When he's explaining this to me, what comes to my mind is in Harry Potter, the creatures that run the bank, with the pointy nose and the pointy everything. And
I was thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly what came to my mind. He's looking at it, and it's got its hands, covering its eyes because he's got his flashlight on his headlamp. And he is not sure how long he's staring at it because he's literally in shock because he's like, something like this isn't supposed to exist. And at this point, he sees it's moving its hand, and he looks and he realizes that it's got his book in his hand. And it snaps into his mind that this creature has been close enough to steal the book from him. And he freaks out. He just sweeps up his bedroll, grabs his stuff, and starts running towards the trail. He trips, dumps everything, gathers it up. And as he's gathering it up to run, the creature starts whistling again, and he gathers it up and runs all the way back to his car, losing all of his stuff, gets in his truck, I think it was, and just drove home. And, when he's telling me this story, I'm like, I've heard of a lot of things, but I've never heard of anything like this in my life. And, but when he's telling me this and I looked, talked to some people, he's a very, credible person. He's all there. This is the only experience he's ever had. I decided to put it in my book because it's just such a fantastic story. I love it. So fast forward to last summer. So that was a couple books ago. I had a lady come to me and she said, "Oh, are you John Olsen? Is this your book?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Oh, I loved your book. I got to tell you, I loved Trolled on Mount Naomi, which is the name of that story." And I said, "Well, thank you." And she goes, "It's kind of interesting because my husband for years and years told me that he was hunting on Mount Naomi and came across a creature and he explained it exactly like the one that was in your book. And I didn't believe him until I read your story and realized that he's not the only one that's seen that creature." And I was just kind of like, wow, somebody else has seen this creature. And I related it to Pagwaji, which is a Native American creature that are these little creatures that live in the forest. They love to steal things. They're really mischievous, kind of violent at times. But that's one that I definitely it seems way out there, but I've had somebody corroborate the story, which is amazing. And like I said, when I was interviewing the guy, you could tell the fear in his voice. And it had been years and years and years since this happened. Yeah. And he was still afraid of it, afraid of that night. So
the other thing I was thinking of is there are a lot of UFO sightings around Mount Naomi. Yeah. Maybe it's an alien.
Who knows? Yeah.
Who knows?
Who knows if they're all connected somehow?
Coming to gather some water or something.
Something crazy like that. You don't know.
Yeah.
Melissa, does it remind you of what Lauren keeps?
Maybe.
My daughter had a couple experiences with very similar. It was more whitish, but similar rake creature. We were in a cave and somebody thought we saw one, and we all saw something white sitting on a corner, and they ran from that cave.
Oh, I bet. I interviewed a gentleman who had an experience with it was either a rake or a wendigo in the Sierra Nevadas. Pale creature like that in the middle of the night. So yeah, that's one that I love hearing about, but it's really rare, but really very creepy. In my experience with doing, when I hear something, like when I interviewed that gentleman and I wanted to try and find something to connect it to. So I went through Native American folklore and found the Pagwaji, which were, explained exactly like he said. It's fascinating to me that all over the world, they have encounters with creatures like that. They might have different names for them, and the folklore in some places may be a little bit different. But, cultures that are worlds apart, running into the same creatures with the same kind of things, there's no coincidence. You know what I mean?
There's gotta be something, yeah. So tell us where we can find your books.
So you can find them all on Amazon. They're both in the softback version or Kindle version. I am currently trying to get them all on Audible. I have 2 on Audible right now. The first one and Stranger West. And I am working to get Stranger US and Beyond Stranger Bridgerland on. They hopefully, cross my fingers, will be up in a couple months.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah.
I listen to audiobooks a lot. I also like having the book form just because I can highlight and mark pages and stuff.
Right. I do that too when I read. So
you said you had another project in the works, book number 5.
Book number 5, again, it'll be stories from all over the U.S. Don't have a name for it yet. I'm kind of racking my brain of what to do with that. But yep, and that should be out again in July or August. So
that'll be fun. And people can visit you at strangerbridgerland.com, correct?
Yep. Get all the information. And if anybody wants to contact me, that's a good way to do it as well. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it. You guys do an awesome job.
Thank you. We have no idea what we were doing when we first started, but we eventually started learning stuff, and we've grown now to like 19 countries. And I mean, we have quite a few listeners. So it's been a journey, and it's been fun, and we've learned a lot, met some really fun people, and now you're one that we can add to our list.
That's right. Definitely.
And I want to have you sign my books at some point.
Oh, awesome. I would love to.
Okay.
Destination Mystery is a production of Mystery Media Group. You can find our podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
If you enjoy our show, please like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. We will be introducing other Mystery Media Group guests in our upcoming episodes, along with weekly bonus material. If you'd like to see more pictures and evidence from our adventures, visit www.destination-mystery.com. You'll find a link to our blog, as well as a link for merch and contact information. Until next time, find your own destination.
Solve the mystery.
This is a production of Mystery Media Group.
Yay!